So welcome to this, I believe, 14th lecture in this series about grounding spatial relations. I say it's language, I'll say it's just concepts that we're grounding. And in a sense, it could be viewed as a case study. Last week, I announced that we want to go toward higher cognition, and we're leveraging the properties of high dimensional fields. And you'll see this is what happens here. And this is sort of our working horse for higher cognition in a way. So let me first recall what we did last week, what I will be using here today. So last week, I pointed out how high dimensional neural fields enable new functions, new over low dimensional fields. And I'm listing here the three with the binding, the visual search, or attentional selection, and coordinate transforms. And again, it's not just a question of the dimensionality of the fields per se, it's the fact that these fields combine dimensions of a different nature. For instance, here, a field would combine color space and visual space, or here it would combine the position of the eye in the socket, or of the gaze in the head, and the retinal field, two very different kinds of spaces combined into one space. In that sense, these high dimensional fields anatomically bind these different dimensions together, because one location in a high dimensional field like that represents a combination of values along one of those dimensions, here along color, and another value along the other dimension. For instance, this peak binds green to that location. This jargon of binding is the term used in cognitive science. So that's a very general property. And so today I'll illustrate how that's going to be used. Excuse me. So I wanted to elaborate a little bit on visual search. Last week I pointed out how liberal visual search works in principle under these conditions. And the idea is that you query a bound representation, here color and space being bound together. That you assume you have bound input from the visual array, that is, neurons tuned to color and to location would represent the input. These are these localized peaks of activation caused by that kind of input, and then you query that bound representation by boosting the bound representation along boosting it along the dimension you're not interested in, or you don't have information about, the spatial one, and in this case, and localized along the one that you have a cue. For instance, if you're looking for something blue, you boost every neuron that encodes blue, and then those neurons that have bound input will go beyond the detection stability, make a peak, and from that peak you can actually then read out, by marginalizing along the color dimension, read out the location of that blue object. And that's the basic mechanism of visual search. Now, I just want to illustrate a little bit more deeply, because this is actually very fundamental to biological vision, human vision, but also vision in a lot of animals. In many cases, visual search like that is accompanied by, it's actually in some sense causally followed by a gaze shift to the object. That is, you tend to look at things that you select that way. From this, you would have information about the location on the retina, let's say, of the object, and then you can shift your gaze there. You can also attend to objects without doing that gaze shift. It's called covert attention. In the laboratory, you can do that. In the real world, you sometimes do that, but not most of the time. You will actually shift gaze, but it's not that you first shift gaze and then attend. It's actually you attend, and that is part of the gaze shifting mechanism. So it's very prevalent, and is a fundamental mechanism of human and actually animal vision. And it's, if you think about cognition and action, it's actually even more important. You could say that every action that you do as a human being is preceded by a visual search. And that's true in the sense that every action, and maybe almost every action, is oriented to objects in the world. maybe some actions might not be like you could wave your hand without actually attending to that location. But in that case, you would actually direct your attention at a communication partner, because it's a communication gesture, and you will actually look at the partner that this is directed at. But anything that you can think of, I challenge you, is of that nature. Even somewhat cognitive operations, for instance, if you do arithmetic or mathematics, you would actually attend to a particular location on your workspace, for instance, on the blackboard or on your piece of paper that you do the calculation on, and then apply your mental thought to that location, to the symbols that are noted down at that location. It's a very broad concept and very important to recognize. Just for those who know a little bit more the technological side of things, you may know that a lot of the use of machine learning techniques actually bypasses this step. So in many cases, there will be a response that there is a certain object of a certain kind in the scene, but it's only because the algorithm actually is able to suppress any irrelevant information, and it's not automatically true that an algorithm like that will actually know where the object is. There is some more recent work that actually does also address attention. There's also a notion of attention that's not exactly aligned with the psychological property of attention, but it's certainly something difficult to understand and fundamental that is still not really part of mainstream artificial intelligence. William James talked about attention when he wrote maybe one of the first textbooks on psychology 150 years ago. And so that was one of the fundamental building blocks for him to think about the human mind, about attention. So I just say that as a bit background for those of you who don't know so much psychology. It's a very, very fundamental thing. So here's a way of how that would work in a little bit more realistic setting. In a realistic setting, the visual space is two-dimensional. Here, retinal space. This is an example from Jan Tuku's thesis, where this is an image of a robot that has a hand like that, and the robot looks down on the table and sees its own hand and sees some very simple objects, which are actually just little slips of paper in different colors. And the robot is supposed to find a particular object like that, and that's here defined by hue again, the color hue, for instance, finding the green one, which would be this object. And so the notion is that you have one of those elementary feature space fields. We use this term feature space. So this is the feature and that is space. Of course, the feature itself is also a space, a feature space. So it's a little bit ambivalent, that term. So that's a very typical situation that you will see in a moment, where we have three-dimensional fields, 2 dimensions of which are the visual array, which is 2-dimensional. And the third is a particular feature value, here, color. So again, you have localized inputs which are now lead to these little blobs of activation. So here, these 3 things are 3 blobs of activation that come from the visual array, and the location as projected onto the horizontal plane here is the retinal position of these objects, and the elevation is the color of these objects. So for instance, this is the blob that represents the red object up here. This is the blob that represents the green object up there, and this blue object is up here. These 2 are from other things. For instance, this here might lead to some activation. So if you're now, so that's your forward vision, right? Your forward vision, this very simplified scene. So because of that, you have these individual blobs. If you had a more complex scene, you would have all kinds of activation in that scene. And now to bring an object into the foreground, you give a cue, which here would be a color cue. Tells I'm looking for the green one, and that would be a boost that only applies to those activation variables that represent something around green. So it's has a certain width here in the along color, and would boost all the neural locations that overlap with that slice. So in 2D, it's a slice, what in 1D is a ridge. And so here you see that the input from the green object overlaps with that slice, and that will lead to the creation of a peak. A peak in 3D would be some kind of blob of activation. And that is the only, if things are tuned right, this is the only suprathreshold object. And you can then project. It's always projected, but once this becomes suprathreshold, it will induce a peak in a 2D purely spatial field. And the location of the peak in the purely spatial field would then be the information about where the green object is. So now you could direct gaze at that object, or you could direct your gripper at that object, or you do other mental operations on that object. And I'll show you in a moment some more interesting operations you might do. So that's how visual, so attentional selection works in this picture. This is just for one dimension. You can do this also for multiple dimensions. I'll show that in a moment. And again, you will see in the examples I'll show you now, every little architecture, actually in the rest of the course, all the architectures I'll show have a little visual search machine somewhere in their early visual part. So here is an image from a very recent paper. This was published actually just last year. It's one of my students, Raoul Grieben, whom some of you might have met. And that's a rather complex model of visual search, and it actually also has a whole component that deals with how you build memories for scenes, working and long-term memories for scenes. So all these little boxes here actually contain fields, and just a few of these boxes are blown up in the two pictures I'll show you. And so here, I first want to show you this feature extraction path that is a feed-forward path. So from the camera image, which again has only very simple scenes, will be shown on very simple scenes. Sorry, you extract feature values. So for instance, here this system does contain the color dimension as we just talked, the hue value. Now, this hue space using the particular representation of color typical in computer vision is not physiologically realistic in detail. You might know that in the nervous system, we actually have these opponency principles there. We have three opponent systems that represent three color contrasts from which one can then reconstruct color. But the ideas are the same. This will be a different concrete mechanistic way of spanning the space. By contrast, the orientation extraction is really a pretty standard model of how oriented elements of contrast are detected in the nervous system. It's essentially forward connectivity that extracts orientation. We use the saturation of the color signal, so we're looking for the orientation of colored objects in the world, but you can also do this from luminance, crude luminance itself, or contrast. And then we have a little size feature. The size feature actually in practice are two different sizes, a horizontal and a vertical size, and it's some special sort of a scale hierarchy that always selects the largest scale at which there is continuous structure, and along horizontal, and then separately along vertical. That would give you two size fields like that. So there are, the output of these filters are again 3D feature spaces. So in each case, they all share the visual dimension, the spatial dimension, and the third dimension is the feature, the color, orientation, or size. These feature maps can then ultimately project to a two-dimensional representation, like I just hinted here in this previous slide. Could project onto a two-dimensional representation, and it will be in this two-dimensional representation actually that selection decisions will take place when visual search occurs. So this is sometimes called the salience map. There's a whole bunch of theories about that. And this is not yet an account for how salience-based selection occurs, but the one idea is that bottom-up extraction of features of this way may guide attention in a way that isn't modulated by any intention, any goal. So for instance, when you're just looking around a scene, you will be looking at locations in the scene that are have high saliency, so that have a lot of energy in these feature channels. And that is actually empirically true. For instance, very typically, humans look at locations where there are edges or even corners where edges cross. They will look at points of high contrast or high saturation. Colors do matter. And they will have a tendency to look at a particular spatial scale. So at relatively bigger objects, but not ones that are only partially observable. Now, when humans look around natural scene, it's not all bottom up, because when humans look around the natural scene, they will see stuff, and that stuff creates mental states. And these mental states, for instance, you see people, faces, hands, and so on. And so recognizing these and creating the mental states, that actually will lead them to guide their attention to particular parts of the visual array that is it's important for the kinds of things they see. For instance, when it's humans, they will tend to look at their eyes or at their mouth. So it's actually difficult under natural conditions to distinguish between this emergent bottom-up selection of attention, purely salience-driven, and the top-down, which is essentially a form of visual search. That makes it a little bit hard to study, and how that literature is actually quite complicated. So we all know that the statistics of input, so the structure of the scene affects looking and attention, but that's not all. Knowledge about the scene also affects attention. So visual search is the idealized case. A visual search is what I just hinted, is that you have a goal that is encoded here in these sort of model settings by particular feature values. For instance, you're looking for an object of a particular color, of a particular orientation, and maybe of a particular size. This is called conjunctive search, because you're giving values for multiple dimensions that characterize the object. In the example that I'll show you, these feature values are actually extracted by looking at a target object. You're showing this, an object like this, and you're extracting these feature values from the object, and then you can represent them as a search queue. And then the visual search consists of biasing feature fields. This is actually a copy of the feature fields that I just showed you. What I had just blown up was this scene feature space map, or space feature map, we call it here. And there's a copy of that that has different dynamical properties that actually does the guidance. It's called scene guidance. It's the visual search. And it does that in the way I hinted, that is that there would be slices that represent the feature value that you're looking for, and different slices for the different dimensions. And then you're summing across space, and the summing across space will actually represent the amount of overlap the different entries into this into these multiple 3D maps have. And so locations that have a large number of overlaps, so of course, have matching feature values along a large number of dimensions, those will have more energy here versus those that have less. This model actually also deals with searching your own working memory. You might have built a working memory, which I haven't explained how that works, off the scene, and you could also query your working memory, right? If you have working memory, you still have to select within your working memory the object that you're currently referring to. And these two can be combined, and this paper is actually about how the combination of these two things explains a certain number of effects. So that's why it's much more complicated than what I'm just saying. So that will be the top-down path, right? And here is an example. This has noise, this video, for some reason. It's mostly sound. Raul Greben made this video, and it just illustrates this system. This is the input. This is the salience map. You see here the things that are currently salient. And what the system actually does currently is make it samples the scene. For instance, it selects this item here, and this is always the sigmoided activity of that. And what it then does is it extracts the feature values at those locations. This would be, for instance, green and large, and this particular orientation. And these are the feature maps that it extracts, and it will build the scene memory. So for instance, here you see these little entries here are entries for 4 objects, and I think it's working here on the 5th, which it will enter here then, and they're entered in these 3D maps. So this is 3D in the sense each slice is a slice through the 3rd dimension. So for instance, I don't actually know exactly which one, the orientation. These two would be one particular orientation. I actually don't remember which one it is. Maybe it's just horizontal one. And this would be another orientation. These are the two. So that's how it does built scene memory, which I didn't explain. And I also say, you see sequence of events here, selections, like this is selected, and then in the next moment something else is selected. Like this here at the bottom is selected. That will be this object and will be entered also somewhere here on the right. And that I haven't explained yet how that works. And that will be something I start next week. How does sequential activation happen by itself? See, the scene is stationary, so this is not triggered by a time-changing input. This is autonomously generated within the representation. That will be a very important part of understanding higher cognition, how we autonomously generate sequences of thoughts, of events, of attentional selections. So far, just take that from given that somehow magically that works. Now, here you see some change in the scene. As you see, it's actually a camera image, so how it pushes some object here into the scene. Now, just show that again. Just put that in, and this system actually has a transient detector that notices that something in the scene changes, and that's something that human vision definitely has. We have transient detectors, so whenever there is some transient in the scene, you tend to bring that into the attentional foreground. It's a bottom-up, salience-driven selection of attention. That's why you want to wave at people to make them look at you. Of course, there can be a lot of change in a scene. Like if you're outside and there's a very lively scene, a crowd of people, then it's hard to see the waving person. But if there's only one object that changes like that, then you will be sensitive to that change. And that's how your attention is attracted to locations where things change, and you will typically tend to them and then actually update your scene understanding. So here we've wired this up so that the changed, the object that suffers a transient actually serves as a target. So now the system is actually looking for an object of that with those feature values, which would be this object. So this is specific, right? We instruct the system by programming it through its architecture to do that task as you would do in the laboratory. So the new object, look for a matching object to the new object. And so to show you what happens, takes a little while. And then it actually selects a object that is, so this is actually the result of the transient detection. It takes a little while. It's now attending to this object, storing the feature values of that object in some feature maps. And so it's now looking for a symmetry matching partner. And you will see that it selects this object first because this object matches in color. Maybe, I'm not sure what, maybe it has enough overlap in orientation. And that's because this is more salient. This is a larger object, has a lot of energy. And it will, though, be rejected because the system notices that it isn't a perfect match on other feature dimensions. And then the second selection actually is the right object. And so that's the answer. The system finds the matching object. So there's a lot more here than I can explain in this short lecture. I'm not going to expand on that more for these purposes. I'm just going to give you a flavor. This is sort of the state of the art, so models that can account for visual attention selections, also paying attention to an object that represents something that you know about your target object, and do that in a process model that can take actual input, even though it's highly simplified input, but can take camera input, let's say, and really perform that operation, not just describe it through some mathematical law. That's the state of the art. That's how far these models go at the moment. And there are computer vision models, again, that are not. So this is all just neural dynamics. Everything that you know, it's just a bit more complex than what you know, but there is no algorithm in here or any, winner takes all or some maximal search optimization or anything. It's just the same equations, wired up in a more complex way that achieves that kind of task. So just to give you a little sense how far the reach of that is. And so in the one sense, well, it's good because you can actually use this for real, like robot demonstrations of object-oriented action. And next week I'll show you an example of a robot actually acting on things like that. But it's also very rudimentary. So if you know about autonomous robotics or, for instance, artificial intelligence systems using deep networks, then you might know that they do things that look more impressive, but they don't actually do it really pervasively neurally. They typically have feed-forward filters. So this part here of the model, the feed-forward extraction of features and of informative factors, so those are well done by models like that, but they don't actually have the cognitive machinery to make selection decisions, organize sequences, and so on. And all of that they do by computer algorithms that are not neural, that are not realistic. So neurally realistic, this is sort of the high point. Okay, so that was just a little parenthesis expanding on the visual search part, because that is the core of all object-oriented thinking and acting. It's kind of interesting to realize, right, that plays such a big role. It's a very specialized corner of psychology. It's a small in-group. Most of the work in visual search is about how the time you need to find the object depends on the number of matching or similarly matching objects, the distractors. A very narrow perspective, but it is a very fundamental problem. The other example of using bound representations was coordinate transforms, and it's somewhat analogous. In coordinate transforms, you bind a representation, there's a dimension here, a visual retinal field, with some, in a sense, a guidance cue. Again, it's the value that describes the transform. So for instance, if you know where your gaze is relative to your body, the gaze direction, you can transform the retinal representation of your stimulus into a representation that is centered in where the gaze is centered in your body, let's say, or your head. So this, any location in this field represents a pair of gaze angles and retinal angles, and then along diagonals are all the locations that have the same coordinates in relative to the body. To figure that out, it's an approximation. It will be just a linear transform where you, when you shift your gaze, let's say you shift your gaze to the right, which will be positive values here, then the position relative your on the retina will shift to the left. So you will be along the diagonal if it's the same location in the world. So I'm assuming that you understand that. So I'm not talking about more about the binding. So today I want to show how basically these two functions, visual search and coordinate transforms, with one added thing, namely the representation of concepts, of relations, can lead to relational thinking, perceptual grounding. So let me first talk a little bit about what grounding actually means. So I'll be talking about the grounding of language. Later we'll see it's just the grounding of relational concepts, and there are a lot of other aspects of language that we don't really cover. But it's maybe more intuitive to really use the metaphor of this being language. So language is, of course, a means of communication where we talk about, among humans, communicate about stuff. And in the simplest form, we talk about stuff that we experience, that we perceive, or that we act on in our environment. For instance, I could look at the cup and say that this cup is brown. And then I'm doing two things. First of all, I'm generating language to characterize the scene I see this way. And then if you hear this, you're grounding that phrase by knowing what I'm talking about. You're looking at this cup, and you're able to direct your attention at that cup and saying, that's the cup that person was talking about. So this way of looking up the object that you're talking about is what we call grounding. It's not universally that term grounding is used, perceptual grounding is used in different meanings by different researchers. It's a little bit annoying. Some people talk about grounding, for instance, in the sense of how the word is actually initially learned, which is a different topic really. Arises initially in an evolutionary sense or so. Others, people like Talmi, who has worked very extensively on this, call this actually targeting, how you can target attentions on at objects described by the sentence. So I'm using the term perceptual grounding, which is more typical in the robotic or artificial cognition literature. So perceptual, targeting or referring to objects, sometimes also called the referral problem, I should say. The referral, what does my phrase refer to? Which in the world is the referent of what I'm saying? I'm not using this word referral because we're using a more specific term, reference, in a moment, but I should make sure that you know that's another way of talking about this. So there are a lot of ways how that can happen. In fact, when people communicate, when they're physically sharing space, it's a bit funny for us when we're in a virtual classroom setting and I have this camera, I can use my hands and point at stuff, but of course only stuff here in my image. I can point at these pictures here in the back, but I can't really, it's not something you share other than looking at that screen. So this is a very abstract transformation of that, but still I can point at these pictures here in the back. And what I'm doing there is helping you attend to objects that I want you to attend to, and without necessarily even having to talk about it, by just pointing. I mean, it's strange here in this image, but by pointing at these two images, which are pictures of my kids when they were small, I succeed in establishing reference. I'm talking about these things in the back, and I can call them now pictures. And then I'm using a word, and you can now ground that word by knowing what I'm referring to in this visual scene, which is just a computer image that you have, maybe a tiny little one, actually. So maybe not so convincing. But of course, if you're in a scene, you would be pointing at objects, and you could even hand them and wave them and put them in front of the person you speak to. That's sometimes called deictic code. Deictic is just a word for signing. That's a very embodied form of communication. And so using language names like characterizing the object by its feature values is a next step. For instance, I could say the green book, and you know what I'm talking about. And then a more advanced form of establishing reference is using spatial terms. For instance, I can say the cup to the right of the green book is brown, right? And now, you wouldn't do that actually when you have only a green book and a brown cup there. You would just say the cup is brown if you want to talk about that. You would typically do that if there are, for instance, multiple cups on the table, and you maybe can't point because you're too far, or you're not in the same room, or some other difficulty. And only under such circumstances will you be using relational terms. But we're doing it a lot because we arrive at situations like that a lot. I'll come to that in a moment. So that's a form of spatial language. So here again, I make that contrast between perceptual grounding and describing. I already did that verbally before. So grounding is when you're identifying in a shared scene what the speaker is talking about. So what is to the right of the green object? This is the green object. This is what is to the right of, right? This presupposes that we can ground green object. And then the other thing is seeing what happens here and describing it. So this is from a paper or a project where we actually had a computer a neurodynamic model that would describe that scene, and for instance, like get the blue object and move the blue object, and remember to where it moves it down and stuff like that. And this reflects the problem of generating speech. In this simple experiment, the camera was looking on top of this. There's very little stuff on that scene, and very little stuff happening. Actually, only moved stuff is being attended. And therefore, there are not 10,000 different ways of describing the scene. And that's why we used this very simple scenery. We're describing events here. And generally describing is a much more complex problem because of essentially framing of what do you want to describe about the scene? What do you pay attention to? And if you use relational terms for that, like for instance here, there are relations here in the sense, for instance, of moving an object relative to another, like move it to that or away from that, so on. So in that case, you have to choose a referent, you know, moving to who, in which direction or away from whom, you know, which reference should you use? And that's a vast problem which we've only begun to look at. You should be aware, please, that this is a big problem that's also unsolved in the technical sense. So for some of you might be familiar with the fact that there are programs that can automatically label images, and they you know, would, for instance, say that in this image there are certain kind of objects and so on. But they actually do that in a very simple way or some other way. Or let me make the most dramatic example. For instance, you can Google something and it will show you images that match your description. But they only do that in a very low-level sense, in that these images have descriptions themselves, and there's some words that also appear in those descriptions. But it is a focus of a lot of current research, including by DeepMind and by Google, to do more. That is to really have image understanding, to understand in the image what objects are in the image and how they relate to each other. And not all of those techniques are neural, of course, but so that's a frontier of research to try to link symbolic description like language to sensory stuff, motor and perception. Okay, so we chose the example of spatial relations as an entry point into this whole literature of linking symbolic descriptions to sensory motor experience. For a reason, the spatial language is something deep. It's part of language. A part of language that evolves slowly. For instance, Indo-European languages are very similar on this account. It's also something that takes a long time to learn in childhood, and that you're not very good at learning in a new language. So it seems like a structural element. And it's actually, a lot of these terms are called structural terms in linguistics, for structure words, and sometimes you have to learn those words early, you know, in learning a foreign language, you have to practice that early. So very famous, I'm just learning Russian. The Russian verbs of motion that express motion relations are famously tricky, not easy to learn. So here are some examples, you know, to left of and top of and front of, toward the south, and so on. Those are spatial relational terms. These terms are not totally universal. There's an interesting attempt to look across languages at some kind of ontology of spatial terms like that. So not all languages use the same terms. Some of you might know that, for instance, in the US, people use the absolute directions, north-south, and so on, much more than we do in Europe. For instance, you would say southbound, you know, go southbound on that highway, or northbound, and so on. Probably related to the fact that a lot of the US is sort of somewhat flat, open skies that you might actually know where north and south is, while a lot of Europe is much more, has a smaller scale of hilliness, and it's not so easy to orient to these absolute directions. Who knows? There are some remarkable phenomena where some people use absolute geographical landmarks, for instance, where people living on an island use toward the beach, or, you know, inland in daily life. They would say, oh, get me the cup that's toward the beach when you're sitting in the living room. And so that presupposes that you always know when you're in the living room in which direction the beach lies. And very similarly, something about some, I think some people in the Andes, you know, in Peru somewhere, some old language there that, like pre-colonial, that uses living on a steep slope in a way, mountain ridge, that they have terms like you would say, like, oh, your shoelace is open on the hillside shoe, right? So they would use on a local scale reference to absolute scales, which again presupposes that you always know where uphill and where downhill is. And I'll come to some subtleties within our Indo-European languages in a moment. So this is also a very good example for us, because reference frames play a big role in spatial referral. And I'll give you a classification of four things, four limit cases, actually all of which have some relevance that illustrate that. So for instance, when you're talking about spatial relations, you can talk about orientation and position, and you can talk about the speaker and listener. The speaker and listener don't always have to have the same position, but in many cases we're thinking about that, versus the object that you're talking about. So for instance, when I say on my left, now there's something, then I am using orientation relative to me. That is, I'm assuming I have a preferred axis, like my forward direction, my nose where I'm looking, and I'm referring to that orientation, and I'm also positionally centering the code, the description in me. So on my left would be something, for instance, that is in front of me and on my left, and for instance, not that's in the back of me, more likely. You can have more typical, you can have, again, the position centered in me as a speaker, but the orientation is relative to something absolute. For instance, you would say north or south, or you could say something with respect to the wind. I don't know, I was in the Navy, so probably there is something like Lee and Luv, which in German, which would be toward the wind or away from the wind. Then the more common situation, so these are a little bit exotic here. More common situation is, for instance, what I just said, the cup to the right of the bottle. And that's sort of a subtle mixture of reference frames, because in terms of position, I am centering the representation in the bottle. So we call this bottle then the reference object. It's the position centered in that reference object, and it's to the right of the bottle, but right or left is with respect to me, the observer. Right? I'm looking at the object, the bottle, and the cup is on the right of that bottle from my point of view in terms of my orientation. So I'm establishing an axis from me to the bottle, and then to the right of that is the cup. So it's centered in the bottle in terms of position, but it's centered in my axis of orientation relative to the bottle. So for instance, if as an observer, you have a different relationship to the bottle, then the right might be your left if you're like opposite. So that's an interesting mix of these two values. And you can actually also have the orientation relative to the object and the position centered in the speaker. For instance, you have that here in the trains in the region, leave the train on the right-hand side, and I think in German they say in Fahrtrichtung rechts, so they actually make it explicit that the orientation is anchored in the train, and the train has a particular orientation by its velocity vector, and then relative to that orientation on the right. But for you as an observer, it's positionally centered in you because you're in the middle of the train, so you know what or somewhere inside the train, you know what the right then means from that point of view. If you were outside, then that would be not the correct understanding. So you can see it's complicated and subtle, and I want to give one example to point out how subtle it is. So for instance, in front of has different meanings in different Indo-European languages. So for instance, in English and in German, if you say in front of a particular object, then you're using a frame that's attached to the object. For instance, if you drive along a street and you tell the taxi driver there's a parking car there, and you tell the driver, drop me in front of that car, then in English and German, the taxi driver will drive past the car and drop you after passing the car. So it interpreted the in front of as being centered in that car. And that's because the car has a its own intrinsic axis. You know, a car has a nose, a forward axis, and it's relative to that axis that in front of was defined. While if you do this in Portugal, for instance, as I know from my own experience, then the taxi driver will actually center the in front of in our reference frame, and therefore will stop before reaching that car and drop you, before. So in front, from my perspective, and the car is sort of the upper limit of that. There's a whole PhD thesis about that, was written by a Portuguese linguist. So spatial relations are tricky, and these are a deep, so they connect to something that is hard to learn. That must mean a lot of neurons must be tuned to do it right. And so that's why it's a very interesting thing for us to enter into. And you will see in our models that we need also a lot of infrastructure to get this right. So I'm just touching the surface of this. There's a whole field of research. So you already saw, in many of these spatial terms have reference objects. So in this classification, these can be used absolute, but all of these here have reference objects. So reference objects here, to the right of the green book, the green book is the reference object, and it serves here to center the reference frame, while the orientation is an absolute. It's egocentric frame, so I keep it fixed. It's attached to the speaker. And these things are called relational concepts that have this property of having a reference object. They establish a relationship between two things, right? The reference object, we call the other thing the target object. So here the cup would be the target and the book is the reference object. And that's actually a representative that we chose of a very broad class of mental operations. I already hinted that movement relationships are of that nature. A ball moves to another ball or away from something. That's also a relation, right? The relation of being the target of a movement or being the source of a movement is a relationship. But it's much more broader. You could say all of arithmetic lies in this class, because you could say there is a relationship. You add two numbers, it gives you a third number. So the relationship of these two is what gives that result. You could say, to the right of is true if they have that relationship, and false if they don't. So it's a function of the positions of the two objects that returns a truth value, and mental arithmetic is a function of two values that returns a third value, which doesn't have to be binary, for instance. So it's a very broad class of things that you can look at this way. And this picture of a function of two arguments being a relation is actually points to our ultimate motivation. In information processing, it is a very natural thing to think of mental operations as functions, because information processing presumes that you can give arguments like to functions by collecting from memory. In the Turing machine metaphor, you have a memory where you can store things and retrieve from memory when you evaluate the function. So you need to have the function as a operational thing, would be a subroutine, and then you hand to it arguments by reference or by value, and then the function can return a value. And that is something that is actually not clear that the nervous system can do, because in the nervous system, it's just a neural network. It's a huge neural network. So how do you pass arguments in a neural network? It's not clear how. Essentially, any subnetwork that might represent a particular function can only get as argument whatever it is connected to. And so you have to figure out how connections pass arguments, or have that function of that functionality of passing arguments. And that's what we'll be getting at. So that's a little bit the larger significance. You might find it funny that we do all this work on just to the left of and the right of, but it's sort of an exemplary study for getting to this capacity to do something like relational concepts and ultimately function calls. Yeah, and that coordinate transforms, I think I already said that, right? But let's maybe make it explicit why. So why have reference objects and why coordinate transforms? Well, at least it makes sense that if you want to talk about to the right of this object, that if you have some neurons that are specially tuned to do to the right of, then you have to arrange for these neurons to apply. And that arrangement could be a coordinate transform where you represent this object centered in that location. And that if you do that, then you can apply the same network to these two things. So only in that sense that is true. So here is a network. You'll see it's not very concrete. This is a network. This is something we published 10 years ago. And I'll show you more recent versions of that. So this is a very simple architecture. It also took real images, but very simple ones. And it did perceptual grounding and in some sense also description generation. So here it again has only one feature dimension, which is color. So it only perceives these different colors. These are actually 3 slices out of a 3D field. And it has nodes for the relationships. And I'll show you in a moment what these nodes are, what kind of synaptic patterns these nodes are connected to. And that is how concepts are formed in this literature. And I'll give you more examples later. And so what this shows here is the 3 things that you need to now make spatial comparisons within a neurodynamic architecture. So one thing is that you have to bring the objects that you're talking about into the foreground. Now, for instance, if you want to talk about the green object, you have to be able to select the location at which the green object is to then compute anything on that location, for instance, spatial relations, right? So that's visual search. So you have to do visual search. The other is coordinate transform. That is, if you want to talk about where something is relative to the green, a very good way to do that is to represent that other thing, that whole scene in a reference frame that is centered in the green. And so that's what this thing will be doing. This is actually a shortcut for the coordinate transform matrix that I just showed you, that is able to transform the locations in this original image to a representation that is then centered in one particular object. And then you have to have comparison operators. That is something that expresses to the left of or to the right of. That's maybe not so trivial, not so complicated. Once you have centered the object, you can imagine that in your network that gets excitatory input to the right of that center and no or inhibitory input everywhere else, that would return a lot of output when there is some input where the synapses are strong and positive, and not return anything or low levels of activation if the object falls anywhere else, and similar for left off, above, and so on. So we call this a kernel, some kind of distribution of the synapses, or input strengths, weight strengths, and so on, that would be spatially tuned to encode these regions in space. Is easy to imagine. So if we combine the idea of coordinate transform and such synaptic patterns, then you can see it's quite flexible, because with coordinate transform we can bring anything to that synaptic pattern, and then by applying the other input, then we can decide whether the relationship is there. And I'll show you that in a moment. So here I'm taking you through some steps in this architecture. And in the architecture that we published, then we actually did these steps really by hand or from the outside. And I'll talk about how this happens more autonomously later. In fact, really technically, I'm only explaining tomorrow how this runs fully autonomously. So in this original architecture, we would start to ground a phrase where red is the reference object, let's say green to the right of red. We would start by doing a visual search for red. The visual search for red consists of giving a slice input into the red slice of the 3D scene. So only in that slice input can create a peak. So here, for instance, the peak arises here, but not here or there, because this field, you see the lighter blue color, this field received that boost from the slice, and only a red object can come into the foreground. That's visual search for red. The other thing is that we characterize the red as reference object. So if I say the green to the right of red, then I'm assuming my language machine, which we don't model here, marks the red as a reference object, and we have here two fields for the spatial location of target objects and of reference objects. And so the field for the reference object gets a boost, not the field for the target object. Actually, I'm a little out of order because it seems that I already had a target object. Yeah, I should have started here because we actually first brought the green object into the foreground, the green to the right of the blue. We actually first put the green object here in the target field, and we did this by doing the visual search for green and then boosting the target field. And so here's an interesting thing. The spatial location, so just the spatial dimension of these color space fields is coupled one-to-one, so spatial location matching spatial location, one-to-one, to these two spatial fields, the target field and the reference field. So you're summing along color and just projecting onto space, and equally, so the connections along this path and along that path are the same. But if I boost this field, that is, I give a homogeneous input to this field and not that field, then only this field is able to go through the detection instability, make a peak when it gets input, and not that field. And as a result, when I create a peak here in this 3D field, for instance, the green slice, that input is passed to this, building a peak here, but not passed to that. I mean, it is literally passed in the sense there's a little bit of input here, but it's not able to make a peak because it's not boosted. So this way of boosting the different fields is something like what other people model as a gate, a gating of input, that is of selecting among the multiple directions in an architecture the branch that you're currently actually working with. And so it's an interesting property of dynamic field theory that is actually very cheap. It is essentially through the instabilities that you can manipulate which part of the architecture is currently involved, simply by assuring through the resting level that that part of the architecture has a chance, given the size of the inputs, to build peaks. If you inhibit or have low enough resting levels for any other parts of the architecture, they will not actually get engaged in the task. So we don't need specific gating, we just need that control of the detection stability. That's generally how we organize our architectures. We have to understand where the boost comes from, right? And I'll show you later a more elaborate version where that is organized. So that's how we got originally the target object here into this target field. And then if in the next step, as I started to say, we're looking for the red as a reference object, we boost now this field. This is sustained, so this peak stays, but this field now forms a peak at that location. And so that's how we have been managing to get, we've managed to get a peak that represents a target and a peak that represents the reference in two separate fields. These roles, the grammatical roles of these two objects being separated. So that happened by this boosting technique, but it also happened by doing this sequentially in time, doing first target then the reference, or could be the other way around, doesn't actually matter the orientation. There is some psychophysical evidence that humans actually do sequentially attend to reference and target object in spatial language. Some of that evidence comes from ERPs, and there's some psychophysical evidence like that, including some that we have found ourselves. So this is a reasonable assumption. Now, the next step is to base the target representation in the reference object. So what we do is here we create a so this is the coordinate transform, usually the one you see. You see one dimension is the reference object that serves the role of gaze, that specifies what transform we want to make. We want to make a transform that's centered on the reference object of the target object. And so you see this little subthreshold peak is already the solution, because if you're looking from the point of view of this object, then that object is a little bit to its right. So here's the center of this transform field, and a little bit to the right is the target. So the target is represented here as centered in the reference. Well, done to be that way. So this is the reference field. And now we can apply the target operator. I hope I have, for instance, a simple case, so there are two different ways how this can work. One would be that I actually have a node where I to right node that has this synaptic field. So everything here on the right, that you see the lighter blue color, everything here on the right would be excitatory for that node. And conversely, the node projects to everything here on the right with positive synaptic strength. So for instance, if I set that node, then everything here will get some activation. And when the object falls into this right part, it would create a peak. Or I can do the description mode, which would be where the peak arises because of these inputs, and these different nodes compete, and then the right node would win because something falls right into its receptive field. This would be the receptive field of the right node, this light blue color, while let's say the left node would not get any input, and the above node would be some kind of half space up here, would get not as much input, and the same for the bottom below node. So that's the spatial comparison operator. And see, there's a single synaptic pattern. Here's a very simple pattern where in the whole right half is positive and the whole half on the left is negative. That leads to that categorization. The actual kernels we used are a little more differentiated, and I'll show you in a moment some typical kernels, and we chose them to match some psychophysical results that we had for this. Just first, I want to show you a few videos that illustrate how this works. So again, in these videos, these boosts that you will see, the different processing steps, are actually applied from the outside. They are not autonomously generated. So here we start by activating a color node. That color node actually controls the boost, the slice here. And we're also giving then in this case, the target, we're saying the green target. We're giving this here a boost. So this was applied from the outside. So from here to here, the boost here and the green up here. And what happens now is autonomous. So autonomously now the green is selected here, and that is passed in the target, and the field is established here. And then we're releasing the green and the boost from activation. And now we're boosting the red as a reference object. We're also boosting this field, and as a result, there is a peak being selected here. This peak comes up. And the last thing, I think this is where's the green relative to the red? This is a case, a query where we're making a description, but guided by these two, the relation. So we're now saying, by these two objects, we're now boosting this and also boosting those. And as a result, there will be, see here, the object can come out, and now these are receiving input from the different receptive fields. You see a little bit the color here reflects that. It's actually indirect because these nodes, this gets activated and then it projects back. And that's how we see a little bit the signature of the kernel. So here the target centered in this object is here on the right, as I said earlier, and the right node will have a competitive advantage and it is winning. And so in the end, we have given the answer by saying, it's to the right. That's sort of how this works. So in this architecture, we were able to combine description and grounding by choosing these boosts in an appropriate way. So for instance, which object is above the blue object, we would give a boost to above. We inserted blue as a reference, and then it will answer, it's this object here. So you saw here that as the reference field is present, it is now able to project this here in a frame that's centered on that. So everything is now looked at being centered in this object. So this here shows up somewhere here because it is above the reference object. Oops. And there we go. And then once that's the case, these are all reciprocal, these connections. So the object also comes up as a target object here. So we're giving the spatial answer. And then we can actually also read out what color that is. And that is based on projecting this now back into this frame. And we're reading out from this top field where the color. So we're projecting out this spatial dimension and receiving the color value. And so we can say it's the red object that's above the blue object. And this is the most unconstrained description. Where's the green object? You're just boosting green. Just boosting green. and it's a target. And then actually it works that it simultaneously finds the reference object and the relation. So it could actually do multiple things. So what it does is selects this one and chooses to the left of. So the green is to the left of the blue. That's what the relationship, the description. So it's a description generation. Kind of cool. So this is sort of a first elementary thing. We actually tune these kernels here at the bottom. These kernels here, we use those, tune these to some psychophysical data. There's data in the literature where people get different scenes like that. D is a distractor. And what they do is rating. A lot of the literature is like that. They have ratings as saying, is this a good example of above, off to the left of, off to the right of, and so on. And you see that, very often it's just 100%. It's like very good examples. And then depending on the configuration, you get different probabilities. And the models are the gray bars and the white are participants. And so we can fit that. Frankly, it's not very constraining. It's just kind of easy to get these fits to be right. So these rating data are not so deep, frankly. But at least we get some constraint on the spatial extent and then over which range things matter. You can see what you're probing is how the boundaries of the kernel. How far can you go? If you bring in distractors, it really destroys the relationship. For instance, here this is a much weaker. This here is much weaker example as being above R than this is. Interesting. You wouldn't predict that perhaps. Well, this is again a very nice example of above. This is sort of 50-50. Well, here the distractor doesn't matter. Here it matters. Interesting. Good. I wanted to point out that we transferred everything centered in the reference object, and everything meaning the potential targets. Actually, in a moment that we can have multiple targets, candidate targets transformed. One could, in principle, also just transform the synaptic fields themselves through a technique, a convolutional technique. That's a bit different from what I showed in the lectures. This was our original model, actually, that Julian Sandomierska developed. And we don't know, actually, frankly, it's also possible that it would be working this way. So it's again the idea that you would just have one of those, we call those semantic templates, and that you could then flexibly use them by shifting them onto the location of the reference object. So it's very intuitive. For instance, to the left of, centered in this object would end up here, if that's your kernel, and to the right of, below and above. So that's another possible way of how it could be organized in the brain. The deep networks, some of you might know, do things like that. And what they do is they have a copy of these kernels in every location. So they do this by this weight sharing, where they just copy synaptic weights, which is, of course, not biologically plausible. It's certainly not reasonable to assume that the brain has expends so many synapses on relations, so that it would have a different neural network for every possible location of something. And of course, also the learning of that would be very costly, because you would have to have seen to the right of relation at every possible location in the visual ray or on the retina. Okay, that's just the concepts. And now I wanted to show you a bit more advanced architecture that does this much more flexibly and also autonomously. And I'll not explain the autonomy aspect this week. I'll do that next week. But it's more complete, and you'll see in a moment, because it has the processing infrastructure for that. So this is an architecture that makes a conceptual commitment to either ground or describe. So for instance, it has discrete nodes that represent color concepts. This would be red, yellow, green, and so on. And these nodes have that meaning. I'm not sure I have a graph for that now. I'll show you in a moment. By having synaptic patterns connected to a color representation, and certain region in hue space is then the region that activates the red node and also can be activated by the red node. And these two directions of coupling are important for the two modes of description. So in the grounding direction, you activate the color concepts to represent the language. So for instance, I know red, I'm looking for red. And then I have a spatial representation. Oops, I'll show you in a moment. I have some feature representation that I will explain in a moment. And in that representation, I'm selecting a orientation, and the activity in this representation comes from the visual array. So for instance, I'm seeing the stimulus, saying the red, and then the grounding would be that I recognize I'm talking about this thing, and that means that in my spatial representation, there is a peak at this location. So I would be able to point at, to grasp, or to look at the red object. That would be grounding. And then the describing way of operating on the same model would be that I have this, again, these discrete nodes, and I get the same visual array, and now it's the array that drives activation. And if in this array, through some mechanism from the salience, the red wins, it creates a peak here, and then I will be reading out what color is at that location in the way I've hinted, and that will activate that node. So the node red becoming active is a description of the scene that's driven from the visual stimulus. This is sort of bottom up, there's a top down. These are the two things that this architecture systematically does. So this is the architecture, a simple form of it. It has the same logical structure as I just said, showed, but it has the machinery to make it more operational. Let me first not point out it has the same logical structure in the sense here is the machine for visual search. This is the color space representation. This the target reference field is just flipped here in terms of the plot. There's some extra stuff here below that I'll be getting to. And then there is the relation field. There actually also there's an extra one, but this would be the one that we just had, the field that's centered in the reference coordinate that we just had. So what's new are all these nodes here on the left, and the nodes are essentially what make concepts explicit and which now enable us to autonomously operate in the systems. So we have concept nodes for color concepts and for spatial relation concepts. Some subtlety that every concept actually is two nodes. We model this by single activation variables. They're really small populations of neurons that these population variables represent. There is a application here in two senses. For every concept, you have always two nodes. One, the blue one is what we call a working memory node. So that's a node that can have sustained activation, and the other is one that doesn't. And that's how we can sort of distinguish between storing what concept we have in mind to ground and whether we're currently working on it. So when we're currently working on it, it's activated, and when it's in working memory, it is only this neuron's on. And there is some connectivity that makes sure that that's the case. We have also an application in the sense that we have every node as a reference and every node as a target. So this is the target group, and that is the reference group. This is like binding. That is, now you have two, sometimes called role filler binding. So you have you can talk about red as a characteristic of target and red as a characteristic of reference, and we've simply solved that by having different neurons for that. So every combination, red as a target or red as a reference, is a neural population for that. That's a very simple form of doing that. These are discrete nodes, so it doesn't look like a high dimensional field, but you could think of these as two values along one dimension, and then the color is the other dimension. So you could say this is a two-dimensional field of color concepts and role concepts, but it's sampled discretely. These here are for the sequential organization, and I explained that only next week. These have to do with the condition of satisfaction of autonomously recognizing that you're done and then turning off a node once you're done. So I can explain the notion of concept by talking about the color concepts. And again, there is some machinery here that is primarily for behavior organization. You can think of all of these three being the same thing. It's one-dimensional fields over color. And any node like that has a reciprocal connectivity to a particular region. For instance, the green node would activate neurons, in some interval around green. In the model, it's a Gaussian synaptic connectivity. So Gaussian pattern of input is provided to this region when the green node is active, and conversely, if there's a peak here in these fields around green, it activates the green node. And similarly around red and blue. So these are categorical. They subdivide the space into different regions. Categorical, that is, the neuron gets activated and actually goes through detection instability, has a peak that's even sustained here for the blue, or it's self-stabilized here for the red. And the peak doesn't really depend on exactly where the color is, as long as it falls into the receptive field of that category. So that's why we call these concepts. They're categorizations, very trivial kinds of categorizations, still pieces of hue space. So these are color concepts. And the spatial concepts are similarly defined by their synaptic pattern. So I didn't put that into the plot, but you have already seen that the right node would project onto this relational field with a cone that is centered here in this, in the center of this field, and has activation patterns here on the right. So it's essentially would be something like that, centered in the center of that field I'm just talking about. So these synaptic connectivities, that's what this concept here sets up. And to the right, similar above and below. And conversely, there is an activation pattern, is a synaptic pattern here that feeds into this concept and drives that concept. So it's bidirectionally coupled. Actually, I highlighted these different things here in different slides, but I don't think we really need that. So here the spatial relationships, and again, here we have these for the spatial fields. We have we bind that to the grammatical role. We call this grammatical. It will be also a role as reference or target by having a copy for reference and a copy for target. And that's a scene representation. So this is this behavioral organization stuff that I didn't fully explain yet, that will regulate that the whole process occurs automatically. So here's an example of this architecture running, and oops. And so I want to first explain that a little bit. This is the input to that system. Simple unichrome objects, because that's the only thing that we can really do well. We're giving it the input, where is the orange relative to the green object, and we're giving it that input by activating the corresponding node. So for instance, here the color description of the reference, we call these production nodes. These are the ones that, the nodes that are, that when they're active, they're actually providing inputs to the features field. So we're activating the green for reference relative to the green object, yes, and the orange is the target. So in the target representation, we activate the target. And the spatial term we're not specifying, because that's where the answer will arise. And that's it. So that's the encoding of the phrase by putting these two nodes in there, and then we're giving it a go signal. And it should be, yeah, going. So here you will see the spatial location of the reference object. Here you will see the target candidates. This is a field where more than one peak can arise, and this is a field where only one of them is selected. So this is where the answer will come. This is the condition of satisfaction field. That is, we call that's where actually the relational stuff happens. So here is the representation of potential targets centered on the reference. So as soon as a reference is selected, you will see here a peak or multiple peaks arise. So in one first step, there's a reference and a target candidate. The reference here on the left, I think this must be already, there's a unique green object. It's going to be this one here. The green object is the reference. The target actually, I think, is currently the same. Oops, sorry. It's supposed to. Let's just run it from scratch. And did I mix now to? Yeah, this is the one. What is to the right of? Sorry, I have 3 videos here, and I switched involuntarily. So I showed you in the next video first. That's awkward. Let's keep that's the video we were looking at. So where's the orange relative to the green? And it will answer with a spatial relationship. So at some point it selects, yeah, here it selects that green object, and then it will come up with a target. There are actually 2 possible targets, 2 orange objects, right? These 2 objects, and it will select one of those, the one at the bottom, and then it will activate, I guess, below. It will activate here below. And this was actually the more advanced, because this does partial description, and the simpler one was this one, which was inadvertently I skipped. So here, what is to the right of the green? So you're handing in green and right. See the right operator comes up. The green as a target comes up, and then it should be able to find that location and then answer orange. And see there are multiple occasions that come up, and then only one of those is overlapping enough with this, and that would be, I guess, that one. And so there, yeah, here you see it selected this object as to the right, because centered in this left object, it is right in the cone, and then that's recognized as a orange object, I guess. So that's how that machinery works. And so the last, and I think this is the last one I have, shows you how this actually gets to higher cognition, because now you can do things like hypothesis testing. So for instance, here you have a scene where the 2 red and 2 green objects, and you're saying the red cup that is to the left of the green cup, then you essentially have to try out different green cups. For instance, if you try this green cup, there is a red cup that is to the left of, so that's a good pair, and this would be your answer. If you're selecting this green cup, there is nothing to the left of it, is a red cup that's to the right of it, so that will be not the correct one. The program and maybe humans might select this green cup first as a candidate for a reference object because it is in the foreground, it is more salient. So the program actually, the model definitely does that because this is has a larger salience value, and you will see in a moment. And so what it has to do is it has to be able to reject that hypothesis. So that's already really cognition, entertaining hypotheses, rejecting them, and then finding alternatives. And the model actually does that. And I haven't explained how this autonomously happens. I just want to give you sort of an intuition for the material that is involved. And here are different snapshots through this. So as a first step, here's the field of reference objects. First step, it actually selects, as I predicted, the green object here on the left, because that's the more salient green object. You can only select green objects at this moment because there is a boost only to the green slice, which is not shown here. So once it has done that, it represents everything centered in this object here. These 2 fields are 2 fields that are centered in that object. So all other objects are now centered in that. And oops, in this next moment, you see some candidates. These would be these 2 red objects that are now represented here, centered in this leftmost field. They are, of course, to the right of that green. So here, the little shadow, they are to the right. And that's not in this kernel. It's not a good example of to the left of. So it doesn't actually fire the relationship. Instead, it fires what we call the condition of dissatisfaction, which turns off the original intention. So that's why the intention goes down. And you have here something we call the inhibition of return. That is, this object is retained as a peak in this field. So remember that you had previously selected this object, and that will act inhibitorily. So the next time around you have this inhibition here, you will not actually select the same object again. You will look at the alternative. So the second step, after you've inhibited this away, you're selecting the alternative green object. Now everything is centered in that object, and then you will see, I think I have one more slide, you see that the two greens here as candidates, no, sorry, the two red as candidates, now one of them should fall right in here, and the other one should be somewhat up here. And no, it's sort of up here. And that's a good candidate off to the left of. And so there's a peak being formed here in that reference field, and that gives you this as a target response. And so the system identifies that. So I haven't explained how the temporal sequence occurs, but if you assume that there's this temporal sequence of events, you can see that how this would be trying out the different relationships and finding both a match in this case, but also a mismatch in these other cases. Here is a run of that. So here, this is the scene to the left, the red to the left of the green. So it's this one. These are screwdrivers. And actually, it also selects this reference object first. You see it's winning because it's more, it's closer to the camera and therefore a little larger, and that makes it more salient. Here you see the reference object centered representation with the left kernel, and this is the conditional dissatisfaction with just the negative. Is everything that's excitatory here is inhibitory there, and vice versa. That's, you see the colors are complementary. That's how it works. You can see, and so it rejects. So it has selected this reference object that's wrong, and that it inhibits this now. No, actually still going on. So here they are not right there. So now inhibition occurs. These targets go away. This is inhibited, and now it selects the other target object, finds the target, the target object that match that, these two, and now it will select among those the ones that fit. This is the one that fits, which will amount to be that one, and so it selects the target response here. So now you should be all motivated to understand how this autonomously works, and that will be the topic of next week. I have this last slide. Actually, this is just a very simple example of grounding movement relations. So it's the same architecture, just have these movement relations. So you need to have movement direction. Actually, maybe I'll do this next week, because I will show you this to remind you of grounding. And so I'll just close by saying that the higher dimensional fields arranged in architectures deliver higher cognitive function, and the function demonstrated was perceptual grounding and describing scenes. So one thing to keep in mind is that we were arranging now these different fields in these architectures, and I was taking you through the different components. And it's actually not trivial that these components have these functions that we design them around to be responsible for. And we say it's the reference field, the target field, and so on. This is all just labeling, which is talking about these fields as doing certain things. But of course, they're just fields that make peaks, go through the detection stabilities, so that they are doing that stuff, that doing the function that we ascribe to them, is only because of the architecture, how they are ultimately linked up to the sensory inputs and interpreted at the outset by some motor system. And so it's not trivial that that would be rechanged as we change the activation patterns in the architecture. And you already saw one element of that when we made the architecture flexible. That is when we were able to sometimes put a selected object into the target field and sometimes into the reference field by boosting these fields. And that already shows that we were able to, the meaning of this as a reference and target field was mediated by that, right? So by the effective functional connectivity in the network. And it's flexible, as I showed you, because of the instabilities, because the instabilities determine whether a field participates or not, and in a sense, determine in which capacity. For instance, if you arrange that when the reference node is on, the reference field can make a peak, then you have made sure that the reference field has that function of being a field that represents reference objects. So that's a property of dynamical field models that we don't always, it's not always so visible, because you have a lot of architectures, including connectionist architectures or cognitive classical information processing architectures, which have neural networks or boxes, and they say this is the working memory and this is that and so on. And it's always a question, how does the function come about? Just by me calling or is it by design, by actually creating code, for instance, for information processing that makes sure that this module has that function. And the critical thing for us is that this function is really emergent and robust. That is, it's by design, by how the architecture is created, that the different fields have their function, and that they retain the function as the patterns of input vary. That's a property of dynamic field theory. It's essentially the robustness of the solutions in a subnetwork in any of the subfields, that they make peaks, make selection decisions, make working memory, and so on. All of that's their dynamic regime, and their dynamic regime is somewhat invariant under the inputs they get because they're stable. Stable states resist change, and therefore when the inputs change a little bit, they don't change very strongly, up to the instabilities. So if we include the instabilities in the design by making sure the instabilities occur only under appropriate conditions, then we have assured that the function is invariant. And that's something, for instance, that in connectionist networks can be the case, because our networks are also connectionist networks in a sense, but isn't necessarily the case. You have to look at the dynamic regimes to make sure that they have that property.